Pi in Lexington, Kentucky. Pi, can you hear us? What's up?
Hey, Big D! What's up, Dan? It's good to see you, hear from you again. Ocean, it's really cool to see you. I think you're a great guest.
Thanks, man. Yeah, dude, we're going to have to catch up sometime. I don't know if I need to go where you are, you need to come here, but it's got to happen, so.
We can definitely make it work. My question's for Ocean. I heard that he was, Ocean, it sounded like you're on a journey, and I think you had mentioned that a couple of times, that you're, may not necessarily be at the destination that you plan to be at, say 10, 20 years from now, but I guess I'm really just wondering, how far in your journey do you think you are with regard to establishing like a really competent position on where you are with your spiritual/God belief? And then I guess what other questions are you looking to be answered before you continue going on from where you're at?
It's a good question. I like that. So I can't say exactly what my position is going to be 10 years from now. I don't know. It's possible that I could change radically from the position that I'm at now. I like polytheism. I'm convinced by it. There's a part of me that's actually looking for what arguments there are against polytheism. I haven't really found anything satisfactory, but I am looking, just because I think that the part of practicing faith is to be challenging yourself and questioning yourself as much as possible. As far as where I'm at on the journey, it depends on. I don't know where I'm going to be winding up, so I don't know exactly where I am as far as that goes. But where I'm at now is a position that I appreciate, and I've fallen into a position of teaching others that are part of this faith as well. That I've read a lot about this. I'm fairly informed on it. I've been establishing communities and helping them grow and helping people get access to sources that they're looking for, because a lot of heathens generally are really hungry to find historical sources, something that's vetted and historical, rather than what you usually find when you're looking for pagan texts, where you get into this like wooey, strange shit. Let me
stop you right there. Aren't there people that might say that your beliefs right now are?
Oh, I'm sure.
Wooey, strange shit.
I have definitely gotten that before. That my beliefs are wooey, strange shit. But the answer that I have to that is that my position, I believe, and I believe I can defend it, is coming from a rational position, and a philosophically rational position. So, and that's a huge discussion. I'd reference the Non Sequitur show with me and Eric Murphy having a conversation about that. If you're interested in exploring that conversation, it's whether or not I'm in a position that's well grounded from an epistemological standpoint or from a rational argument standpoint. And it's an interesting conversation. But yeah.
Pi, do you have something you wanted to add real quick?
Yeah, Dan, could I get your impression? Because I think hearing how you would answer the question would be really enlightening as well for both us that are listening to you and the guests as well.
So your question was, where do I see my beliefs 10 years from now?
No, more or less where do you see yourself with regard to the confidence of your current position that you have with regard to an existence of a God or not? And then what questions are you waiting to be answered before you are willing to, change your position or modify it?
Great question.
Okay. The second part of your question I didn't answer. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah.
And I can follow up.
I'm assuming you're talking about the Christian God, like Yahweh.
Any God.
Okay. I don't have any beliefs for any gods right now. The criteria for, and I would say, as far as like whether or not a God exists, I'm like 99% sure that there are no gods, or not. I wouldn't say that. I would say I'm 99% sure that my belief that my confidence in the gods, that there are no gods, is 99%. I'll just leave it at that. Whatever philosophical problems with that might entail, because there comes a problem with defining what gods are, right? So if we're talking about deistic conceptions of gods where I don't necessarily have a criteria to demonstrate their validity, then I have no way of knowing whether they exist or not. So at that point, who's to say? But if we're talking about most mainstream conceptions of, Yahweh or the God of Abraham or, any of those kind of monotheistic traditions, they have certain qualities that I think we would be able to
are indicative of a people that made them without information
right
that was privy to them at the time.
Yeah, they have qualities that we can at least examine. And so, like, if I was to change my confidence on that, I would want to see which qualities we can examine, and what evidence that we might have for those qualities, being of most parsimoniously being explained by those gods rather than, say, a naturalist explanation.
What I'm generally looking for is coherentism. If you're going to have a God belief and you're going to be basing it on experience, it's generally fine with me. Is I think that if you're going to be dismissing experience, you need to have a good reason for it. With respect to the Christian God, however, as far as like how the Christian God is described, there's some attributes that it has, like omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, and these things, when you start to examine like what they mean and what they entail, come up with a description that is just absurd. And then when you look at the defenses of them, when omnipotence is challenged and what does omnipotence mean, you get into more just philosophical problems about how it's described and what it entails. And there's a really good argument that I like for as far as dealing with Christianity, it's divine hiddenness, that if there's a God that is omnipotent and omnibenevolent and omniscient, and he desires to have a relationship with you, then something that is omnipotent and omniscient would know how to have a relationship with you, and it doesn't make sense for something that is omnipotent to desire something and not have it. So if that relationship is wanted by the God, then you should have that relationship with the God immediately. And if he desires that relationship with all of humanity, then why isn't all of humanity having this relationship with God? So
yeah,
that sort of starts to fall apart unless you're a Calvinist and then you believe in the elect and you bite down hard on that and have a lot of fun, and everybody else is a fucking reprobate, right?
Yeah, would it be cool if I summarized what I heard real quick just before I head out?
I couldn't hear you there, Pine.
Sure.
Can you say that again?
Oh, would it be cool if I summarized what I just heard before I head out?
Yeah, I say go ahead.
Okay, cool. It sounded like, Dan, you were saying that you more or less don't know because you don't have a criteria for what a God is, but you're looking for evidence that would convince you that it was true. And then it sounds like from Ocean, it's that he found a position that makes sense to him, that gives him a lot of comfort, that makes sense in his worldview, and he's looking for evidence to prove that he's wrong. And so between the two of you, I think there's a really interesting contrast in the sense of one person's looking for evidence to believe something, and the other person's looking for evidence to stop believing. And I wonder which between the two of you is the more rational position. But that's an
interesting conversation. I think that there's
I really appreciate it.
Sure, absolutely, man.
Appreciate it.
I think that there's a subtle mischaracterization. I liked what he said, but at the same time, I think there's a subtle mischaracterization that there is the reason to believe is something that I've dealt with, as far as trusting experience and that exploration and deciding to wing it and experiment with this. With respect to looking for reasons to not believe, I think that that's more accurate, what he was talking about. But with looking for evidence as far as why to believe, I think that the polytheists have a clear definition of God. It's clearer than.
I'll be honest. I don't know if I have a clear definition. Honestly, I'd love to hear what your definition is.
Stephen Dillon puts forward 3 attributes. So there's the disembodied mind as a attribute, great power as an attribute, and I'd have to grab the book to get the 3rd attribute. Just give me a second. I don't usually bring out this argument. Disembodied
it's not really
mind,
an argument.
Great power,
it's
and
just
highly involved mind. Sorry. Yeah, it's a definition. So it's tautologist. So disembodied mind, great power, and highly evolved mind.
Okay.
So it's going to be, you're going to be dealing with something that is non-physical.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I would be repeating myself. Sorry.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to understand is how you choose what's true and what's not true. Because it seems like if I presented you a book of some pantheon of gods and you would know if I made it up or if it came from 1,000 years ago or whatever, how do you know that any of what I'm saying is real? How do you determine from what's true from what's not true? Or is that even a coherent concept? I mean, within your belief system, because I don't know.
We get into the coherentism conversation. If you're going to be talking about some like physical claims, then we have you have the foundational conversation around physicality, and you kind of move from there. And this is getting into the conversation that I think that I told you that I was annoyed with before this before we started this.
Maybe this can simplify it. How do you validate a non-physical thing as existing?
Logical consistency and coherence of experience.
Is it possible that something can be logically consistent and also not be true?
Sure.
Okay, so how do we know that it's true then if it's not a reliable method?
What do you mean by reliable? Wait, what are you?
Well, because what I'm trying to get at is I know, I mean, there are some theologies that could, in some construct, be coherent. I would probably not agree with it, but I mean, if you worded things enough, you could make it coherent, but that wouldn't necessarily make any of it true. I mean,
sure.
It could, look, I mean, the universe could be created by unicorns. You know, I don't see why that couldn't be coherent. I mean, it's just, it doesn't necessarily logically.
This gets into some other stuff that we were discussing, I think prior to this, as far as like what standards that I have as far as God believes, that there needs to be an experiential aspect of it. There needs to be shared experiential aspect of it.
Aren't experiences
there also needs to be historical verification.
But we also talked about how your Christian friends interpreted their experiences for the Christian God, right? So it seems to me that experience is also kind of an unreliable method to determining whether something is true.
It's not entirely reliable, sure, but it's the experience of the spiritual aspect that all of us agreed had happened. I found a difference in it. They did not. And that's interesting and fine. It's an unverified personal gnosis.
You yourself said that the Christian God is incoherent. I mean, in some sense.
As described.
Yeah. And so
I think that Christians, when they pray to their deity, and there's a reciprocation, I think that there's a validity there. They're probably worshiping something.
What do you mean by a validity?
God that's,
because you're saying that the Christian God is invalid as a concept. So I don't know how you can say that that's valid if it's not working out, right? I mean, like, it's confusing to me because at one point you're saying the Christian God shouldn't exist or doesn't exist, at least by the description of Christians, but you're also saying that you're including the Christian God in your pantheon. So I don't know.
I don't include the Christian God in my pantheon.
Okay, sorry. Excuse me. But you say that there are people who do, and I don't know. It just seems unreliable to me. It seems that you're taking experiences that you're having and just kind of playing with what human traditions have come up with and fitting those traditions into your experiences. Sure.
I think that I'm realizing kind of what has happened here. I thought our discussion before this was going to be a little bit more productive. Instead, we're looking.
I'm sorry if you think that this is productive.
No, it's fine. Like I said, if this topic comes up, we're going to be dealing with it. No, hold on. We're gonna go through it. So, I'm fine with saying that polytheistic beliefs and that religious beliefs in general need to be provisional, and that we're examining them from a coherent structure. And that if you're going to be looking at things from an empirical structure and dealing with empiricism in order to have certain beliefs, then fine, you can do that. The problem is that if you're going to be basing everything entirely on an empirical structure, you're going to be running into problems when you start dealing with discussions of anything that's outside of the physical realm, such as things like numbers. I believe, for example, that math is discovered rather than invented by humanity. Where you're going on pure empiricism and trying to build a dependable set of beliefs off of that, great. And when you're dealing with spirituality, you're dealing with something that doesn't necessarily have that ability, and that's part of the human condition, and that's fine. That doesn't mean that spirituality isn't true. It doesn't mean that we can't explore it. And I think that trying to say so is a little ridiculous.
Yes. So let me clarify real quick. Ocean and I did have a conversation before that we were trying to make this as productive as possible, and I want to hold myself to that as well by mentioning that I'm really glad that you're here, and I'm really enjoying this a lot. And this clarification is coming from my own point of view as to how to figure out what you're doing, because it really is just a confusion on my part, and not necessarily something like I'm trying. I don't want you to get the impression that I tricked you or anything into coming here, because from what I see
it's not necessarily. I mean, it's not like. And it's not that I'm uncomfortable with the conversation. It's that we were talking about exclusive practice and
yes, and I want to get into that.
And community with atheism. I'm usually termed as an outsider, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
But the epistemology conversation is great. It's just that from my perspective, it is something that's been relatively played out. And that's why I referenced the Non Sequitur Show conversation between me and Eric Murphy, because I think that's a really good example of the epistemology conversation in which Eric is putting up his best and I'm putting up my best. And that's, if you want to see that conversation with me, that's a really good example of it. As far as like the questioning that I see this is kind of going down with empiricism versus philosophical approach of deity and spirituality. It's like a rehash. It's a repeat of the same conversation.
Okay. Well, here's what I want to emphasize here. This was something that I wanted to talk about anyway at the beginning of the show, and I think we were kind of getting into discussion there a little bit, so I kind of almost forgot. But here I am talking about it now. So I want. Yeah,
we can continue. I'm not saying that there's a.
Well, this is. I want to talk about this next point anyway, because I wanted to highlight kind of the parallels between what your community, I guess what you would describe as the heathen or pagan community, is going on today with the atheist community, in that we are both, and I'm going to use people groups with religious identities who aren't necessarily validated by the power structure currently in our country. There are tons and tons of people who, first of all, say that neither of us exist at one point, but also who just simply don't understand where we're coming from and don't really want to. They're not really interested in the kind of cultures that we develop here. And I know that atheists don't have culture by default, but I am talking from the atheist community of Austin. And there are communities of people willing to get together and kind of have these conversations, and that's really interesting to me. So I wanted you to kind of talk about a little bit more on what it's like to be a pagan now in 2018, where there's people who kind of criticize your position, kind of talk about,
yeah. And again, I'm a pagan in the South, right?
Yeah.
But I'm also a pagan in a city in the South. So there's a little bit of differences as far as how things are. I grew up in the country and I lived in the country as a pagan for some time. So, you get into some situations socially in the South, especially where if you're not Christian, you ain't in. And I wind up identifying a little bit with atheists as far as like what their predicament is in society in this, specifically these places, because we have a lot of similar beliefs. We have a lot of similar social beliefs. We both think that people that in marriage equality, for example, a lot of like social liberties. We're on the same page, and religious expression liberties. Is I think there's a little bit of a divide, but for the most part, we're on the same page. And the thing that I find that I think this conversation has a little bit of is that there is a similarity between Christianity and atheism that is a practice of exclusivity, that there needs to be a propagation of your idea and in the public sphere. And from one perspective on the atheist position, it is a pushback. It's saying that I deserve to have the ability to have my own beliefs and be able to express them publicly. Thank you very, very much. And the pagan has that similar aspect as well. But the pagan also gets caught between the Christian saying all public practice of religion should be Christian, and the atheist saying all practice of religion needs to be out of the public square completely. And the pagan is sitting there in the middle of that going, well, this person wants me out and this person wants me out. All right, we're kind of interestingly stuck here. And it's when Christianity came about, this was a new idea. And I before the show, I brought up, I brought a couple of legends with me that discussed atheism and conversation about atheism in pagan backgrounds. And there is a wonderful quote that I'll pull out again, that is said by a warrior in a saga, that a Norse saga, saying, "I never gave sacrifice to Odin, and yet I have lived long." And that is a declaration from somebody who is an atheist in a Norse saga. And this is a character that fights side by side with pagans. And it's not seen as much of an issue. It's seen as something that's like, well, that's this person's practice. We fight together. We're in the shield wall together. And I think that there is opportunity for atheists, pagans, and other polytheists to fight side by side on a lot of these issues that we hold in common. But yes, as long as there's exclusivity practices of, I will not work with you because of your belief system, that's not going to get anywhere. We're not going to make any advancement. We're not going to be productive.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I am definitely of the camp that wants to allow as much religious expression as decently possible. I mean, obviously, there's a point where, my religious belief says I have to kill you. That's not going to fly.
Correct.
In, modern society. But for the most part, like what you're doing as a heathen, I don't see any real problems of why you can't keep doing what you're doing, At least I haven't encountered any problems yet. So and that's interesting.
That's actually a discussion that I'm having with another atheist YouTuber named Surus the Skeptic. He and I are doing a podcast together. And before that, we had he and I met up at Waffle House, and we had a discussion about religious harm, what it means, what kind of propagates it, and how to approach it, and like if you're going to be practicing religion, how do you prevent it? And there was a discussion between myself and some other pagans about, and as well as Surus, what about heathenry is doing these same things as far as ousting other people, creating others, and so on. And we weren't able to really come up with much of an example. Sometimes you get groupthink, and sometimes you get exclusivity, but it's something that, from our perspective, that attitude is to be corrected. You're not supposed to. Your exclusivity practice is something that's imported from Christianity, and I think that that's something that, as well as picked up with atheists, that in their atheism, especially atheists that are ex-Christians, there's latent things in Christianity that are imported, and among those things is the exclusivity practice of I must propagate this idea, and I must people that disagree with this idea are to be excluded. So there's and it contributes to more divisiveness and so on. Yeah, and that's something that from pagan positions we try to have that discussion of stopping that, because latent Christianity is something that we're not Christians anymore. Why are we bringing that in?
Yeah,
it doesn't need to be there anymore. That was part of the harm.
Kind of these old escaping practices that are so ingrained in us that they still affect us even in religious transitions. That's interesting.